Welcome to the Progressive Christian Bible Study. Today we are looking at a famous passage from the Hebrew Bible, Micah chapter 6, verses 1 through 8. And as I always do, I've structured this lesson around the 3 P's: prayer, perspective, and pieces of Scripture. So the prayer for today actually comes from a set of song lyrics by the band Coldplay in one of their recent songs named Broken. And the lyrics just spoke to me, and they sounded like a prayer, so I thought I'd share it with you. Lord, when I'm broken, I'm in need. I feel that ocean swallowing me. Head is hanging, so sorry for me. Oh Lord, come shine your light on me. On that morning, scared and blue, when I'm hungry, thirsty too, send this raindrop down to the sea. Oh Lord, come shine your light on me. Then I know that in the darkness I'm all right. See, there's no sun rising, but inside I'm free, because the Lord will shine a light for me. Amen. Okay, now the second of the 3 P's is perspective. And today's perspective comes from a guest essay that was written by Jonathan Malizik in the New York Times last week. And it's an essay on the topic of work. And in particular, he talks about the connection between work and our sense of worthiness as human beings, which is not quite uniquely American, but is very distinctively American. So I'm going to read an excerpt from that piece and then talk about today's topic. So here's what Malizik writes. A dozen years ago, my friend Patricia Nordine was an ambitious academic, teaching at the University of Chicago and speaking at conferences across the country. Being a political theorist was my entire adult identity, she told me recently. Her work determined where she lived and who her friends were. She loved it. Her life, from classes to research to hours spent in campus cafes, felt like one long, fascinating conversation about human nature and government. But then she started getting very sick. She needed spinal fusion surgeries. She had daily migraines. It became impossible to continue her career. She went on disability and moved in with relatives. For 3 years, she had frequent bouts of paralysis. She was eventually diagnosed with a group of hereditary disorders that weaken collagen, a component of many sorts of tissue in the body. I've had to evaluate my core values, she says, and she had to find a new identity and community without the work she loved. Chronic pain made it hard to write, sometimes even to read. So she started drawing, painting, and making collages, posting the art on Instagram. She made friends there and began collaborations with them, like a 100-day series of sketchbook pages, abstract watercolors, collages, flower studies. She exchanged these with another artist. A project like this allows her to exercise her curiosity. It also, she says, gives me a sense of validation, like I'm part of society. Art does not give Patricia the total satisfaction academia did. It doesn't order her whole life. But for that reason, says Jonathan Malizik, I see in it an important effort, one every one of us will have to make sooner or later, an effort to prove to herself and others that we exist to do more than just work. We need that truth now, when millions are returning to in-person work after nearly 2 years of mass unemployment and working from home. The conventional approach to work, from the sanctity of the 40-hour week to the ideal of upward mobility, led us to widespread dissatisfaction and seemingly ubiquitous burnout even before the pandemic. Now, the moral structure of work is up for grabs. We now have space to reimagine how work fits into a good life. As it is, work sits at the heart of Americans' vision of human flourishing. It's much more than how we earn a living. It's how we earn dignity, the right to count in society and enjoy its benefits. It's how we prove our moral character, and it's where we seek meaning and purpose, which many of us interpret in spiritual terms. Political, religious, and business leaders have promoted this vision for centuries, from Captain John Smith's decree that slackers would be banished from the Jamestown settlement to Silicon Valley gurus touting work as a transcendent activity. Work is our highest good, do your job, our supreme moral mandate. But work often doesn't live up to these ideals. In our descent from this vision and our creation of a better one, he concludes, we ought to begin with the idea that each one of us has dignity, whether we work or not. Your job, or lack of one, doesn't define your human worth. Now that is a powerful point. Your job, or lack of one, does not define your human worth. We often think of work as inherently good, blurring the lines between our work and our identity. I work, therefore I am good. My job matters, therefore I matter. My work has worth, therefore I have worth. So I'm continuing my sermon series this coming Sunday on the good life, and I want to focus on the good life, work, and goodness. Goodness being the quality of being good, especially in a moral sense. One aspect of goodness in our society is work. This idea, again, that work is inherently good. I am good because of my work. And sometimes in our culture, and I mentioned this just a second ago, our worth as a person is equated with what one does for a living. So we ask at cocktail parties when we meet new people, what do you do? And we don't even need to complete that thought because we know and they know what's being asked. It's what do you do for a living? And how we answer that question then sorts us into class. It sorts us into education level or social status. If someone says, I'm a surgeon, you know immediately they've done several years of education, they're a specialist, they're a professional, you start to sort that person. If they say, I am a school teacher, you do other kinds of sorting. If I'm a professor, you do other kinds of sorting. But whenever someone answers the question, what do you do? Not only do we know what they're asking, but the answer to the question begins the sorting process. Again, this notion that worth and worthiness are equated with the worth and worthiness of what we do in terms of our work. Which brings me to something that Peter Gomes once said in his book, which I've showed you a few times, The Good Life. He's the late chaplain at Harvard's Memorial Church. And in that book, he talks about work, but he looks at the issue of work from the perspective of morality. Not what do you do, but rather, what is a life worth living? That's what he asks. What is a life worth living? It's a life that makes a positive dent in the fabric of humanity, and that can happen beyond the confines of what one does for work or what one does for one's career. Being a parent, of course, comes to mind as something that extends beyond what one does for work and also at the same time makes a positive dent in the fabric of humanity. So what Peter Gomes says is he focuses on being good at being a person. Not necessarily or confined to being good at one's job or being good in one's career, but being good at being a person. That's a different thing, and it's far broader than what one does for work or what one does for one's career. And when that's the focus, being good at being a person, we can strive for goodness regardless of what we do in terms of career or no career, work or no work, because work is not equal to worth. What matters is being good at being a person. Which brings me to the third P, which is pieces of Scripture. And I'm going to look, again, as I mentioned earlier, at Micah chapter 6, verses 1 through 8, because this is a passage that talks about what is good in life. So again, Micah chapter 6, verses 1 through 8. And I wanted to read the first 7 verses leading up to verse 8 because verse 8 is almost like a bumper sticker type verse. It's one of the most common, oft-quoted verses, certainly in the Old Testament, but even throughout the Bible. And when I read it, you're going to recognize it right away. But the 7 verses leading up to it are crucial to set the context for verse 8. So here's what the prophet writes. Hear what the Lord says. Rise, plead your case before the mountains, and let the hills hear your voice. Hear, you mountains, the controversy of the Lord, and you enduring foundations of the earth. For the Lord has a controversy with his people, and he will contend with Israel. O my people, what have I done to you? In what have I wearied you? Answer me. For I brought you up from the land of Egypt, and redeemed you from the house of slavery. I sent before you Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. O my people, remember now what King Balak of Moab devised, what Balaam son of Beor answered him, and what happened from Shittim to Gilgal, that you may know the saving acts of the Lord. With what shall I come before the Lord, and bow myself before God on high? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000s of rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? He has told you, O mortal, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justice, and to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. Okay, so the first few verses in this passage are what's called a covenant lawsuit in biblical scholarship. So basically what the prophet does is lay out a courtroom scene here. So God, speaking through the prophet, acts as a prosecuting attorney in this passage. And then the prophet calls witnesses, the mountains and the hills. This is a common trope in the Hebrew Bible among the Hebrew prophets, a covenant lawsuit that God speaking through the prophet as prosecuting attorney and calling elements of creation as witnesses, the jury, to weigh in on the case. And of course, in the courtroom scene, Israel is the defendant. So at the end of verse 2, the Lord has a controversy with his people. He will contend with Israel. That word controversy is a covenant lawsuit word. So again, this is a courtroom scene. Now, a few additional points to make here. First of all, the name Micah, Micah in Hebrew, it means who is like Yahweh. So Micah is what's called a Yahweh prophet. So a prophet who speaks on behalf of Yahweh. In English translations of the Old Testament, we are clued in to the identity of Hebrew prophets based on the spelling of their name. So if a name ends with A-H, most likely you're dealing with a Yahweh prophet. So Jeremiah, Elijah, Isaiah, all Yahweh prophets, and Micah, a Yahweh prophet. Each one of their names means something related to Yahweh. So again, Micah means who is like Yahweh. His name is actually a question. Now, Micah in the passage speaks on behalf of the Lord, capital L-O-R-D. And whenever you see capital L-O-R-D in an English translation of the Old Testament, you're dealing with the Hebrew name Yahweh, which is different from the name capital L, lowercase O-R-D. That's the name Adonai. It's a different Hebrew name for the name of God. But when it's capital L-O-R-D, it's the name Yahweh. Now, why is it significant that it's Yahweh who speaks in this passage? Because Yahweh is God's covenant name. And again, this is a covenant lawsuit. This is someone breaching the law and being called to account for it in a courtroom type scene. And the one who holds the people to account is Yahweh, the covenant name of God. This is the name that was announced to Moses in the burning bush scene in Exodus chapter 3, right on the cusp of the great story of the Exodus. It's Yahweh, the covenant God, who delivers the people from slavery in Egypt and then establishes a covenant relationship with them, marked by things like the Ten Commandments or the precepts of the sacrifices in the book of Leviticus or the precepts of the festivals, the precepts around the Sabbath. All of these rules and regulations, they're all part of the precepts of the covenant. It's an agreement between Yahweh and the people of Israel. Each one of them, parties to the covenant, have responsibilities. And if either one of them breaches those responsibilities, they can be held to account because they've agreed to the terms of the covenant. So, for example, if you go back to Exodus chapter 20, which it's a passage that's known for laying out the Ten Commandments. But sometimes people forget the beginning part of Exodus chapter 20 before the laying out of what the Ten Commandments are. The beginning of it is a covenant statement. I am Yahweh your God who brought you out of Egypt. So God is delivering the people from Egypt in order to establish this covenant agreement with the people. So again, it's Yahweh who does it. Yahweh is the covenant name of God. So to review, Micah is a Yahweh prophet. Yahweh in this passage, speaking through the prophet, is the prosecuting attorney. Elements in creation are called as witnesses, the mountains and the hills. Israel is the defendant. And Yahweh is holding Israel accountable for failing to keep their side of this covenant arrangement. Now, to make this case against the people, Yahweh tells a story in verses 4 and 5. So, in verse 4, I brought you up from the land of Egypt. It's a reference to the Exodus, and it recalls that passage that I just read to you from Exodus chapter 20. So, God oftentimes will recount the history, basically saying, look how long-standing our relationship is. Why aren't you keeping your side of this agreement? It's like a plea that God has. Even though the context here is a courtroom scene, it's still this very passionate case that God is making. So, verse 4, God recounts this history. I brought you up from the land of Egypt. Verse 5, God urges the people to remember all of these saving acts that I have done for you. Again, so I've done all of this for you. Why aren't you keeping your side of the agreement? A couple of specific references in here to Shittim and Gilgal. Occasionally in the Hebrew prophets, you'll have place names listed, as in this case, and oftentimes it's a reference to some big story of Israel's past. So in this case, Shittim and Gilgal is a reference to the crossing of the Jordan River. Joshua is now their leader. He was the heir of leadership after Moses died. So Joshua is their leader. He leads them across the Jordan River and into the Promised Land. Yet again, another great story from Israel's past, like the Exodus story before it. Yahweh here is recalling this history in order to basically passionately plead with the people to return to the terms of the covenant because Israel has not held up its side of the arrangement. Now, it's important to realize, and the prophet here gives us a little clue, and I'm going to read a section from the prophet Isaiah in just a bit because that prophet does something similar to what Micah does here, which is to point out that Israel's failure is not in working or in doing. In other words, in terms of the religious precepts that are part of this covenant arrangement, apparently Israel is very good at keeping them. In particular, the precepts around the sacrificial system. And if you go through the early chapters of Leviticus, you can read about the animal sacrifices, when they were to occur, which kinds of animals, etc., etc. Apparently, they're very good at keeping that side or that aspect of this covenant arrangement. They're good at work. They're good at working, hence where I began earlier. So in verses 6 and 7 of today's passage, they mention burnt offerings. In other words, again, to return to this point, Israel was good at working in a religious sense, the religious requirements of the covenant, these animal sacrifices that were part of this covenant arrangement. They were good at work. They We're good at doing them. Other prophets have made a similar point to this. So basically, they're good at this, and that's not the issue, which I'll get to in just a second. But other prophets, like Isaiah, had called Israel out for something similar. So in the first chapter of the book of Isaiah, the prophet says, speaking on behalf of Yahweh, "What to me is the multitude of your sacrifices, says Yahweh. I have had enough of burnt offerings of rams and the fat of fed beasts. I do not delight in the blood of bulls or of lambs or of goats. Rather," says Isaiah, speaking on behalf of Yahweh, "learn to do good, seek justice, rescue the oppressed, defend the orphan, plead for the widow." Now that sounds an awful lot like the passage we just read in Micah chapter 6. Micah's case against Israel, like Isaiah's case against Israel, zeroes in not on their failure to do these religious precepts, which they're apparently very good at. That's not what he zeroes in on, or not what they zero in on. Instead, both of these prophets are focused on misplaced focus. They zero in on misplaced focus. Israel has failed to be good. They missed the spirit of the covenant by focusing instead on doing the covenant. Now, that's not to say every single one of them is guilty, and oftentimes the prophets engage in lots of hyperbole as if they're condemning every single person in ancient Israel. That would be sort of ridiculous. Most of the time, their accusations are against the priests and the leaders, whom they call false shepherds. Particularly the prophet Ezekiel does this. So their focus is on the failure of Israel's leadership to set the example, not the individual failures of individuals on the ground, even though oftentimes they speak in grandiose terms. The reason why I'm being careful here is not just because I think it's more historically accurate, but also because if you don't do that, if you don't make that distinction that I just made between the leaders and the commoners, leaders and the everyday people, it starts you down the path toward anti-Semitism in Christianity. Oh, look, all of ancient Israel failed. And so in Christianity we find success, or in Jesus first, and then in Christianity we find success. And you see this parting that leads you down this dark path toward anti-Semitism. So it's far better to be more precise and, incidentally, more historically accurate by pointing out that when these Hebrew prophets make these grandiose accusations against the ancient Israelites, it's not every single person. They're being very specific in who they're identifying as the problem. Usually it's the priests or some kind of other leaders in ancient Israel. It's not all the people across the board. But again, to return to the point, Micah's case against Israel, just like Isaiah's case against Israel, and again, being specific about who we're talking about when we're talking about Israel, zeroes in on misplaced focus. Some in ancient Israel had failed to be good. They missed the spirit of the covenant by focusing so much on the doing of the covenant. They missed the spirit by focusing on the work. If you were to skip ahead into Paul's letter to the Romans in Romans chapter 10, Paul, a member of ancient Israel, a Jew among Jews, as he calls himself, a Hebrew of Hebrews, he accuses some of his fellow Jews of, quote, having zeal for God, but not being enlightened. So the problem is not being zealous. The problem is not doing the work. That's fine. The problem is missing the spirit here, missing the spirit of the work. So to kind of bridge the gap between this context and our own as Americans, I think it's very easy to equate one's work with goodness. In the case against Israel, it's the work of the covenant, the sacrifices, the festivals, the Sabbaths, etc., etc. The assumption, now again to bridge the gap back to our context, the assumption is that if we do certain things, if we are good at our work, then we are good. Good in the moral sense. I am good because I'm good at what I do, or I'm proud of my career, therefore that says something about me. Now, it's not to say that it says nothing about you, Because let's say you are a surgeon or you are a professor. You have put in a lot of work to get to where you're at. You've achieved an element of success in your career, and that is totally fine and something you should be proud of. I have my degrees on my bookshelf behind me, things that I am proud of the work that I put in. But we have to be real careful here because we are more than our work. So back to Peter Gomes and back to Jonathan Malizik in his New York Times guest essay. Micah wants the people to realize that goodness or being good is about more than just work. So too Peter Gomes and Jonathan Malizik. Doing good things, being good at being a person is more important and far bigger than what one does for one's work. So then in Micah, when the prophet says, he has shown you what is good, it's to do justice, to love mercy or kindness, and to walk humbly with God. These are bigger things. These are moral things that extend beyond the confines of one's work, extend beyond the confines of the daily ritual of sacrifices that many in ancient Israel were good at doing. So when the prophet says, God has shown you what is good, good is defined in broader terms than merely doing. It's defined in terms of morality, in terms of justice, in terms of kindness, in terms of humility. Which brings us to what Peter Gomes said. What is a life worth living? It's a life that makes a positive dent in the fabric of humanity. It's being good at being a person. And when this is the focus, to return to something I said earlier, we can strive for goodness regardless of what we do in terms of a career or no career, because our work does not necessarily equal our worth. What matters is being good at being a person. So what to me are your burnt offerings, says Yahweh to ancient Israel. What I really care about is being good at being a person. I'm going to show you what is good. It's doing justice. It's loving mercy. It's walking humbly with God, which can happen in any context, certainly in a work environment, but also way beyond the confines of what one does for work or what one does for one's career.